بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Respected elders, beloved brothers and friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Over the past few days, we've looked at a few verses of the Quran in which we got a glimpse of the attitude of the Jews and of the munafiqeen towards the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, towards the kitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran, towards the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And in examining those verses, we also learned a little bit about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes the importance of Quran, the emphasis that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attaches to holding firm to the Quran, and in addition to the Quran, also to holding firm to the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Today we're going to look at another verse, another one or two verses, which will show us something else, teach us something about the attitude of some of the Christians. So far we've looked at the Jews, we've looked at the Munafiqeen. What about the Christians? Towards the end, right at the end of the sixth juz, beginning of the seventh juz, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Ma'idah, لَتَجِدَنَّ أَشَدَّ النَّاسِ عَدَاوَةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الْيَهُودَ وَالَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا. You will find that the most intensely opposed to the believers are the Jews and those who commit shirk, the mushrikeen. وَلَتَجِدَنَّ أَقْرَبَهُمْ مَوَدَّةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. On the other hand, you will find that those who are closest to the believers are الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّا نَصَارَى. Those who say we are the believers. Those who claim to be, who say إِنَّا نَصَارَى, we are Christians. إِنَّا نَصَارَى, we are the assistants of Isa alayhi salam, or the assistants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, very small point over here, scholars of Tafsīr mention that look, when it comes to the Jews, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala simply described them as the Jews, al-Yahud, the Jews. But when it comes to the Christians, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just call them the Christians, al-Nasara. Allah ta'ala calls them الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّا نَصَارَى, those who say we are the Christians. Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kind of use a little bit of a different expression when speaking of the Jews and Christians? One of the reasons which the scholars have mentioned is that look, the Jews were completely opposed to Islam. They had a lot of hatred and a lot of enmity for Islam. Whereas the Christians, on the other hand, they were still not so firmly opposed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They still found it within themselves to listen to the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at least to some extent. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses a bit of a softer address when speaking of the Christians. الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّا نَصَارَى, those who say we are Christians. It's like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying the Jews are the Jews. Forget them. The Jews are the Jews. But the Christians, they say that they are Christians, but if the message of Iman has to be delivered to them, then perhaps they will also, some of them at least, will also enter within the fold of Islam. But in any case, why will you find the Christians to be closer to Islam? ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ مِنْهُمْ قِسِّسِينَ وَرُهْبَانًا. Reason number one, that's because among them there are scholars and monks. And reason number two, وَأَنَّهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ, because they are not arrogant. Again, another lesson that we can draw from this ayah over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is maybe speaking of the Christians, people who maybe have not yet entered into the fold of Islam, yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is praising these qualities within these people. لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ, they don't have arrogance. Regardless of where it is, who it is, not having arrogance, humility, not having pride. These are the kind of qualities that as human beings we should be appreciating. In any case, now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala adds another description about these Christians, these Nasara. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا سَمِعُوا مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَى الرَّسُولِ, and when they hear what has been revealed to the messenger, تَرَى أَعْيُنَهُمْ تَفِيضُ مِنَ الدَّمْعِ مِمَّا عَرَفُوا مِنَ الْحَقِّ. You see their eyes flowing with tears because of the truth which they recognize in it. You see the eyes flowing with tears. We're speaking of the Quran in its own words. So this is where I want to tie this up over here. You see the eyes flowing because of the truth which they recognize in the Quran. We spoke before of the Quran being musaddiqan lima bayna yadayhi. The Quran affirming the message of those books that came before it. Same thing over here. These Christians, those who weren't arrogant, those who weren't proud, who had the honesty, the spiritual and intellectual honesty to really study the message of the Quran, they could see that here's haqq, here's truth, the pure and pristine message of Tawheed. This is the message that the Injil and the Torah have been telling us about. ترى أعينهم تفيض من الدمع مما عرفوا من الحق. You will see the eyes flowing with tears because of the truth which they recognize. Now, although this ayat is referring to Christians in general, there's also maybe another sabab al-nuzul connected to this ayat. The reason for the revelation of this ayat. We know that Ja'far radiallahu anhu left Makkah. Many of the believers left Makkah in the early days of Islam when they were facing persecution from the kuffar. They migrated to Habasha, to Abyssinia. In Abyssinia, they found asylum, they found a safe, peaceful place to live. After some time, after a very short amount of time, Quraysh became a bit upset. Muslims are getting away with it. So they sent someone to Habasha, to Abyssinia. They sent Amr bin As, he wasn't yet a Muslim. They sent Amr bin As to Habasha to negotiate with Najashi. Send these guys back. They don't know what they're doing. Listen to what they say about the Christians. Listen to what they say about Jesus, about your God. Najashi was a fair man. He was a just ruler. He called the Muslims. He called Ja'far radiallahu anhu. What do you say about Isa? What do you say about Christianity? Ja'far radiallahu anhu recited a few verses of Surah Maryam, few verses of the Quran to Najashi. And when Najashi heard these verses, تَرَى أَعْيُنَهُمْ تَفِيضُ مِنَ الدَّمْعِ مِمَّا عَرَفُوا مِنَ الْحَقِّ. He began to cry. Those who were around him, the ministers, the priests who were around him also began to cry. Tears began to flow down their faces. Why? Because of the haqq which they recognize in the Quran. Other ulama say, when Ja'far radiallahu anhu and those believers eventually returned to Medina, it was many years later, they returned with maybe approximately 70 new Muslims. 8 of them who were actually Shami, actually Syrians, who had been living in Habasha. Another 62 who were actually from Habasha, from Abyssinia. This entire group of about 70 people came with them to Medina. This is what the ayat is talking about. These are the people who the ayat is referring to. You find this concept of crying when reciting the Quran found in other verses of the Quran as well. If we have to just turn very quickly to, let me just get my bearings, Surah Al-Isra. Surah Al-Isra, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks again of Ahlul Kitab, again of the people of the book here, not just of the Christians but also of some of the Jews. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ مِنْ قَبْلِ. Those who were given knowledge before them, إِذَا يُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ يَخِرُّونَ لِلْأَذْقَانِ سُجَّدًا. When the Quran is recited to them, they fall onto their chins in prostration. They fall onto their chins in prostration. And then again after that in Surah Maryam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the same thing, a very similar verse, this time referring to the Anbiya. إِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُ الرَّحْمَنِ. When the verses of the most merciful are recited to them, خَرُّوا سُجَّدًا وَبُكِيًّا. They fall down in prostration while crying. They fall down in prostration while crying. These verses, some of these verses that we recited were referring to the Christians, referring to the Jews, referring to the Anbiya, the last verse that we read. But really the message is for you and I. Do we cry when we recite the Quran? One hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he is narrated as having said, إِذَا قَرَأْتُمُ الْقُرْآنَ فَبْكُوا. When you recite the Quran, then cry. وَإِن لَمْ تَبْكُوا فَبَاكُوا. And if you don't cry, if you can't cry, then at least act like you cry. At least put on some kind of pretense of crying. Abdullah bin Abbas radiallahu anhu mentioned something very similar. He says, even if your eyes are not crying, then at least let your heart cry. Even if tears aren't physically flowing from your eyes, at least let your hearts cry. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the ability to read the Quran with the actual level of tadabbur, the actual level of contemplation that is necessary for us to actually be affected by the Quran spiritually and intellectually. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.